The autumn wind carried the scent of burning timber across the Wyoming plains, mixing with the acrid smoke that billowed from what had once been Martha Henley's pride and joy. She stood 50 yards from her homestead, her weathered hands pressed against her mouth, watching orange flames devour the barn her late husband Samuel had built with his own calloused hands 3 summers before his death. "Should have listened when we told you to sell, Martha," growled Tom Bradley, the self-appointed leader of the group of townsmen who had ridden out from Clearwater Creek that evening. His face was hard as granite beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and tobacco juice stained the corners of his mouth. "This land's too dangerous for a woman alone, especially with them savages roaming about." Martha's blue eyes, faded but fierce, never left the burning structure. Inside that barn had been her winter hay, her tools, and the 2 milk cows that were now lowing pitifully in the adjacent corral, spooked by the flames and smoke. "Samuel died protecting this land," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "I won't dishonor his memory by running. Your Samuel died because he was fool enough to ride with the cavalry against them Lakota," spat Jake Morrison, Bradley's second-in-command. "Got himself and 6 other good men killed in that canyon ambush last spring, all because he thought he could play soldier." The words hit Martha like a physical blow, but she held her ground. Samuel had joined the volunteer militia after reports of raided supply wagons, believing it was his duty to protect the growing settlement. He'd kissed her goodbye on a crisp April morning and never returned, his body brought back draped over his horse 3 days later, full of arrows. "That fire's gonna spread if the wind shifts," called out another man from the group. "Maybe we should let it burn," Bradley cut him off. "Maybe watching her livelihood turn to ash will teach the widow some sense." He turned his horse toward Martha, leaning forward in his saddle. "The railroad company's offering good money for this stretch of land, Martha. More than you'll ever see again. Take it and move back east where you belong before something worse happens." Martha finally turned to face them, her graying hair whipping around her face in the wind. "This is my home. Samuel and I broke this ground, planted these fields, dug that well with our bare hands. I buried him on that hill overlooking the creek, and I'll be damned if I'll abandon him now." The flames were beginning to die down, having consumed everything combustible within the barn's frame. The skeleton of blackened timber stood like the ribs of some great beast against the darkening sky. Martha calculated the loss in her head. Nearly everything she needed to survive the coming winter was gone. Her savings were meager, barely enough to buy seed for next spring, let alone rebuild. "You got until Sunday service to reconsider," Bradley said, pulling his reins tight. "After that, things might get considerably worse for you out here all alone." The threat hung in the air like the lingering smoke. As the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, Martha sank to her knees in the dirt, finally allowing the tears she'd held back to flow. The weight of her isolation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and most of the locals had sided with Bradley's faction, believing that driving out the remaining Lakota was the only way to ensure their safety. But Martha remembered the harsh winter 2 years past, when she'd left food and blankets at the edge of her property after finding tracks in the snow. The supplies were always gone by morning, and she'd continued the practice even after Samuel's warnings. She'd never seen who took them, but she knew, in a land where survival often meant the difference between compassion and cruelty, she'd chosen compassion. Now, staring at the smoldering ruins of her barn, she wondered if that choice had been worth it. The autumn night settled around her like a cold blanket, and Martha Henley had never felt more alone in her life. From the ridge overlooking Martha's homestead, 12 pairs of dark eyes had watched the flames consume the barn. Hidden among the scrub oak and tall grass, the Lakota children remained motionless as shadows until the last horseman disappeared into the night. Only then did Swift Arrow, the eldest at 16, rise from his crouched position and signal for the others to gather around him. "Grandmother's stories were true," whispered Little Fox, a girl of perhaps 10 winters, her voice barely audible above the wind. "The white woman with kind hands lives there." Swift Arrow nodded grimly. These children were all that remained of a small band that had been scattered 3 weeks prior when cavalry soldiers raided their winter camp near the Sweetwater River. Their families were dead or captured, and they had been surviving on their own ever since, moving from hiding place to hiding place, avoiding both soldiers and hostile settlers. "She left the food bundles," said Running Deer, a boy of 14 who bore a healing scar across his left cheek from the raid. "Even when the snows came deep, even when her own man rode with the blue coats." The children had been watching Martha's homestead for days, drawn by stories passed down from their grandmother, White Dove, who had spoken of a settler woman who showed unexpected kindness during the harsh winters. White Dove had died in the cavalry raid, but her words lived on in the memories of her grandchildren and the others they now led. "Why do the white men burn what belongs to her?" asked Singing Bird, the youngest at barely 8 years old. She clutched a tattered doll made from corn husks, one of the few possessions she had managed to save. Swift Arrow's jaw tightened as he watched Martha's solitary figure kneeling beside the smouldering ruins. Because her heart is different from theirs. They fear what they do not understand, and they hate those who show mercy to our people. Moonwalker, a quiet boy of 12, pointed toward the homestead. "Look how she weeps, like our mothers wept." The comparison struck deep. Each of these children had witnessed the destruction of their own homes, had seen everything familiar reduced to ash and memory. They understood loss in a way that adults often forgot, completely without the buffer of experience or the false comfort of believing that such things were temporary. "She will freeze when the hard cold comes," observed Black Elk, a thin boy whose ribs showed through his worn shirt. "Without the shelter for her animals, without the feed for winter." Swift Arrow studied the burnt skeleton of the barn, his mind working. His father had been a skilled builder, known for constructing lodges that could withstand the fierce prairie storms. His grandfather had taught him the white man's ways with wood and nails, knowledge gained through reluctant cooperation during better times between the peoples. "We could help her," he said quietly, the words seeming to surprise even him as they left his lips. The other children stared at him. Spotted Hawk, a boy of 15 with prematurely serious eyes, shook his head. "The white men will return. They will see what we have done." "Let them see," Swift Arrow replied, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "She honored our people with food when we were hungry. She showed no hatred even after her man died fighting against our warriors. This is how the circle is completed." Little Fox moved closer to Swift Arrow. "Grandmother always said the spirits watch how we treat those who show us kindness, that such debts must be repaid, even to those who are not of our blood." "But we are children," protested Grey Wolf, a boy of 13 whose left arm hung awkwardly from an old injury. "What can we build that will stand?" Swift Arrow's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "We know the old ways, how to bend saplings, how to weave grass and branches into strong walls. Spotted Hawk's father taught him to work with the white man's tools before—" He didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what had happened before. "And we are many hands working as one heart," added Brightstar, a girl of 11 whose voice carried the authority of one who had helped raise younger siblings. "In the old stories, the mouse people could move mountains when they worked together. The children sat in a circle now, their council forming naturally as their people had always done when important decisions needed making. Each child spoke their thoughts, and Swift Arrow listened carefully to every word. The youngest were afraid but willing. The older ones were skeptical but gradually warming to the idea. "If we do this," said Running Deer finally, "we must work in darkness and be gone before the sun shows our faces. The white men who burned her shelter would kill us if they found us here." Swift Arrow looked around the circle of faces, each one marked by loss but not yet hardened by hatred. "Then we work tonight. We use what the old ones taught us, what the spirits whisper in our hearts. We build her a shelter that will stand against the winter winds." As if moved by a single will, the children rose and began to move down the ridge toward Martha's homestead, their bare feet silent on the rocky ground. Behind them, the stars emerged like scattered seeds across the vast Wyoming sky, bearing witness to an act of compassion that would bridge two worlds, torn apart by violence and fear. Martha had finally retreated to her small cabin as the moon climbed higher, her body exhausted from grief and her mind spinning with worry about the coming winter. She never heard the soft footfalls that approached the burned remains of her barn, never saw the small shadows that began moving with purposeful determination around the blackened timbers. Swift Arrow surveyed the destruction by moonlight, running his hands along the charred posts that still stood. "The foundation stones are good," he whispered to Spotted Hawk, "and see here, the frame posts on this side barely burned. We can use them." The children worked in pairs, their movements coordinated through hand signals and barely audible whispers. Little Fox and Singing Bird gathered armloads of dry grass from the prairie, weaving it into tight bundles, while Brightstar and Moonwalker searched the creek bank for straight willow shoots that could be bent and shaped. "There," Running Deer pointed to a stand of young cottonwoods near the water. "Those branches are the right thickness." He and Grey Wolf began cutting with a small hatchet they had found near Martha's woodpile. their strokes careful and measured to avoid noise that might wake the sleeping woman. Swift Arrow had studied the white man's building methods during the peaceful seasons before the troubles began. His sharp eyes took in the remaining structure, calculating what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt from scratch. "We make it stronger than before," he murmured to himself, "strong enough to hold the winter's fury." Black Elk, despite his slight build, proved surprisingly strong as he helped drag the fresh-cut poles into position. The children had developed a system of communication born from necessity. Living as refugees had taught them to work in absolute silence when survival depended on remaining unseen. As the night deepened, their construction took shape through a remarkable fusion of techniques. Where the original barn had used only nails and square joints, the children reinforced every connection with traditional lashings made from twisted grass and strips of bark. Spotted Hawk, working from memory of his father's teachings, showed the others how to notch the wooden beams so they would fit together like puzzle pieces. "The walls," whispered Brightstar, gesturing toward the gaps between the frame posts. "How do we fill them?" Swift Arrow smiled in the darkness. This was where the old ways would serve them best. "We weave them like baskets, like our grandmothers taught us." Under his guidance, the children began threading the willow shoots horizontally between the vertical posts, creating a lattice pattern. Over this framework, they plastered a mixture of creek mud, dry grass, and clay that Moonwalker had found near the riverbank. The work was backbreaking, but the children pressed on with the quiet determination of those who understood that survival often depended on seizing brief opportunities. Little Fox's small hands proved perfect for weaving the tightest spaces, while Running Deer's height allowed him to reach the upper portions of the wall without a ladder. "The roof," Grey Wolf said, looking up at the exposed rafters. Many of the original boards had been consumed by the fire, leaving gaping holes that would never shelter Martha's animals or supplies. Swift Arrow had anticipated this challenge. "We use what the prairie gives us," he said, leading several children to a marshy area near the creek. There they cut great armloads of cattails and tall marsh grass. Back at the barn, they began laying these in overlapping layers across the remaining rafters, creating a thatched roof that would shed rain as effectively as any wooden shingles. Singing Bird, working beside her older companions despite her tender years, began to hum softly, an old song her grandmother had sung during communal work. The melody was barely audible, but it seemed to lift the spirits of the young builders. Soon, other voices joined in, creating a whisper-soft chorus that drifted across the prairie like wind through grass. As the hours passed, Martha's barn rose from its ashes through the merger of two traditions. The sturdy framework showed the practical efficiency of settler construction, while the walls and roof demonstrated the time-tested techniques of people who had learned to create shelter from whatever materials the land provided. "Look," breathed Little Fox as the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of gray. "The morning star appears." The children had been working for nearly 6 hours, their hands cut and muddy, their clothes torn and stained. But before them stood a structure that was both familiar and completely transformed. The new barn was smaller than the original, but it appeared far more organic, as if it had grown from the earth itself rather than being imposed upon it. Swift Arrow walked around the completed building one final time, checking every joint and connection. The walls were solid, the roof secure, and there was even a small window opening facing east to let in the morning light. "It is good," he said quietly. "It will stand." Running Deer pointed toward the cabin where a thin line of smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney. "She wakes. We must go." But as they gathered their few tools and prepared to vanish back into the prairie, Swift Arrow made one final gesture. From a leather pouch around his neck, he withdrew a small bundle of sage and sweetgrass, sacred plants his grandmother had given him before the soldiers came. He placed this bundle on the threshold of the barn door, a blessing in the tradition of his people for the white woman who had shown kindness when kindness was rare. The 12 children melted away into the pre-dawn darkness as silently as they had come, leaving behind only their gift and the quiet satisfaction of a debt of honor fulfilled. As they crested the ridge overlooking Martha's homestead, the first rays of sunlight touched the roof of the new barn, and Swift Arrow smiled. The circle was complete. Martha woke to the sound of her milk cows lowing softly in what should have been an empty corral. The gentle noise puzzled her sleep-fogged mind. Yesterday evening, Bessie and May had been agitated and restless from the smoke and flames. Now they sounded content, She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, wrapping Samuel's old wool coat around her shoulders as she stepped onto the small porch. The acrid smell of smoke still lingered in the air, and she braced herself for another glimpse of the blackened skeleton that had been her barn. But as she rounded the corner of her cabin, Martha Henley stopped dead in her tracks. Where the burned ruins had stood the night before, a new structure rose against the lightening sky. It was smaller than the original barn, but it stood complete and solid, its walls smooth with dried mud plaster, and its roof thick with woven marsh grass that gleamed silver with morning dew. "Merciful God," Martha whispered, her hand flying to her throat. She moved forward slowly, as if approaching something that might disappear if she moved too quickly. The morning mist swirled around the building, giving it an almost dreamlike quality in the soft light. As she drew closer, details emerged that made her breath catch. The walls showed a pattern of woven branches beneath the mud covering, intricate work that reminded her of the baskets she'd seen Lakota women weaving at the trading posts. The door frame was reinforced with careful lashings, and the hinges were made from bent willow rather than store-bought hardware. Martha reached out tentatively and touched the wall. It was solid, warm even, as if the earth itself had been shaped into shelter. The construction was unlike anything she'd ever seen, a marriage of familiar barn-building techniques with something entirely foreign, yet somehow perfect for this harsh land. She stepped through the doorway and gasped. The interior was spacious enough for her 2 cows and her remaining horse, with space left over for feed storage. Stalls had been cleverly constructed using woven branch panels, and there were even mangers built from split logs. Everything was rough but functional, built with careful attention to the needs of the animals it would shelter. In the eastern wall, a small window opening let in the growing light, and Martha noticed something resting on the sill. She moved closer and found a small bundle wrapped in soft leather, sage and sweetgrass braided together with strips of hide. The sweet, earthy scent rose to meet her, and she knew with absolute certainty who had been here in the night. Her legs suddenly weak, Martha sank onto a pile of fresh straw that had been spread across the floor. The children, the Lakota children she'd heard whispers about in town, orphans from the recent cavalry raid, scattered and alone. They had done this. She thought of the food bundles she'd left at the edge of her property during the hardest winters, never knowing if they were taken by animals or people, never expecting anything in return. She'd continued the practice even after Samuel's warnings, even after his death fighting against their warriors. It had simply felt like the Christian thing to do. Now as the sunrise painted the walls of her impossible new barn in shades of gold and amber, Martha understood that kindness had come full circle in ways she never could have imagined. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her rise quickly. Through the window, she could see riders coming from the direction of town, Tom Bradley and his men, no doubt coming to see if their message had been received. Martha stepped outside to meet them, the bundle of sage and sweetgrass still clutched in her hands. Bradley reined in his horse 20 yards from the barn, his jaw dropping open. Behind him, the other men sat in stunned silence. Jake Morrison was the first to find his voice. "How in the hell did you—" He caught himself and spat into the dust. "Who did this work?" Martha looked each man in the eye before speaking, her voice steady and clear. "I believe it was angels, Mr. Morrison. Angels who work in darkness and ask for no payment except mercy." Bradley's face darkened. "Don't play games with us, Martha. No woman could have built this in one night. You had help, and we demand to know who." "My help came from above," Martha replied, raising the bundle of sage toward the brightening sky. "And I'll not question the Lord's methods when he sees fit to answer prayers." The men exchanged uncertain glances. The barn was clearly there, solid and real, but the speed of its construction and its unusual appearance defied explanation. In a territory where strange stories traveled quickly and grew in the telling, Martha's claim of divine intervention might actually be believed by some. "This doesn't change anything," Bradley said finally, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You still need to sell and move on. One barn doesn't make you safe out here alone." Martha smiled for the first time since watching her original barn burn. "I'm not alone, Mr. Bradley, I never was." She gestured toward the horizon, where the sun was now fully visible, painting the prairie in brilliant oranges and golds. "This land holds more kindness than you know, more mercy than you've ever shown, and as long as that's true, I'll be safe enough." The men rode away in confused silence, leaving Martha standing beside her miraculous barn. As their dust settled, she noticed something else, small footprints in the mud near the creek, and patterns in the grass where many feet had moved quietly in the darkness. She looked toward the ridge where she sometimes saw smoke from distant fires, where she knew the scattered children must be hiding. Raising the bundle of sage and sweetgrass high above her head, she spoke to the morning air. "Thank you," she called out, her voice carrying across the prairie. "Thank you, and may the Great Spirit bless you all." From somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of children's laughter, free and joyful as meadowlarks, singing the day awake. 3 weeks after the miraculous barn appeared, Martha Henley found herself at the center of a story that had spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Travelers stopping at Clearwater Creek's general store spoke of the Angel Barn in hushed, reverent tones, and some made special detours to see the structure for themselves. Martha had prepared for the winter with renewed determination. The barn, built with techniques perfectly suited to the harsh prairie climate, had already proven its worth during a fierce October storm that had damaged several buildings in town. Her animals remained warm and dry while other settlers struggled with leaking roofs and collapsed shelters. But the barn had given her more than practical shelter. It had given her purpose. Each morning, she continued her practice of leaving food at the edge of her property, but now she added supplies that children might need: warm clothing, blankets, even small toys and books. The offerings disappeared regularly, sometimes replaced by small gifts in return: beautifully woven grass dolls, polished stones, or bundles of medicinal herbs. On this particular morning, as frost painted the prairie grass white and Martha fed her animals in the blessed warmth of the barn, she heard voices approaching from the direction of town. Through the eastern window she saw an unusual group making their way up the path to her homestead. Father Michael O'Brien, the traveling priest who served the scattered settlements, walked alongside Dr. Elizabeth Cartwright, the territory's only female physician. Behind them came Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher, and surprisingly, old Henrik Johansson, the Swedish settler whose farm lay 10 miles north. "Mrs. Henley," Father O'Brien called out as they approached. "Might we have a word with you?" Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, curious about this delegation. "Of course, Father. What brings you all out here on such a cold morning?" Dr. Cartwright, a practical woman in her 40s, who had seen enough of frontier hardship to recognize genuine miracles, spoke first. "We've come about the children, Martha. The Lakota children who've been living rough since the cavalry raids." Martha's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean, Doctor." "Winter's coming hard this year," Sarah Mitchell added, her voice gentle but urgent. "Henrik here found tracks near his place, small feet, many of them. Someone's been taking eggs from his henhouse and apples from his storage cellar." Henrik nodded, his weathered face creased with worry. "I not mind the food," he said in his thick accent, "but children, they freeze in the cold that comes. This I cannot allow." Father O'Brien stepped forward. "Martha, we know what happened here. Your barn may have fooled Tom Bradley and his followers, but those of us with eyes to see recognize a miracle when it stands before us. Those children built this for you, didn't they?" Martha looked at each face in turn, seeing not judgment, but genuine concern. Slowly she nodded. "I believe they did, yes." "Then you know where they are," Dr. Cartwright said urgently. "Martha, I've treated children with frostbite before. What I've seen, no child should suffer that way. Not when we have the means to help." "What are you proposing?" Martha asked carefully. Sarah Mitchell pulled a folded paper from her coat. "We've been working on this for days, ever since the story of your barn reached us. A plan to help them survive the winter without forcing them into situations they might fear." She unfolded the paper, revealing a hand-drawn map. "Henrik's place has an old trapper's cabin that's been empty for years. It's warm, sturdy, and far enough from town that they wouldn't be bothered. We could stock it with food, blankets, medicine. I fixed the roof, make the walls tight," Henrik added. "My Anna, she already sewing warm clothes for children, different sizes." Father O'Brien nodded. "And come spring, when tempers have cooled and wiser heads prevail, we can work towards something more permanent. Perhaps a formal arrangement where they could receive schooling while maintaining their own traditions." Martha felt tears gathering in her eyes. "You would do this, even knowing the risk if Bradley and his people found out?" Dr. Cartwright's expression was fierce. "Some things matter more than Tom Bradley's narrow vision, Martha. Those children showed more Christian charity in one night than that man has shown in his entire life." That evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Martha walked to the edge of her property and built a small fire. It was a signal she had never used before, but somehow she knew it would be understood. She waited, the bundle of sage and sweetgrass from the barn threshold in her hands. They came like whispers in the darkness, first Swift Arrow, then the others, emerging from the prairie grass with the fluid grace of young deer. Martha's heart clenched as she saw how thin they had grown, how the cold had already begun to mark their faces with the gaunt lines of hunger. "Grandmother of the Kind Heart," Swift Arrow said formally, using the title of respect his people gave to elder women who showed wisdom and mercy. "You called, and we came." Martha held out the bundle of herbs, and Swift Arrow accepted it with a solemn nod. "I have friends," Martha began carefully, "people with warm hearts like mine. They wish to offer you shelter for the cold months, not as prisoners, but as guests." She explained Henrik's offer, watching the children's faces in the firelight. Some looked hopeful, others fearful. The weight of survival pressed heavily on their young shoulders. Little Fox stepped forward. "The kind Swedish man who left cookies for us to find?" Martha smiled. "Yes, child. He and his wife Anna want to help. There would be no soldiers, no forced changes to your ways. Just warmth and food until the spring grass grows again." Swift Arrow looked around the circle of his companions, reading their thoughts as only a true leader could. Finally he turned back to Martha. "Our grandmother White Dove spoke of a time when the peoples would learn to share this land in peace. Perhaps that time begins with children." As the meeting concluded and plans were quietly made, Martha felt a deep satisfaction settle in her chest. The barn the children had built for her would always stand as a symbol of what was possible when kindness met kindness. But more than that, it had become the seed from which a new understanding might grow. Bradley and his followers would resist, would call her naive and dangerous, but Martha had seen the future in the faces of 12 children who chose compassion over hatred, in the eyes of neighbors who valued mercy above prejudice. The barn still stood solid and warm against the winter wind, a testament to the truth her Samuel had never lived to see, that this vast land was big enough for all its children, if only they had the courage to build bridges instead of walls. As Martha walked back toward her cabin, she could hear the children's voices singing softly in the distance, a lullaby that belonged to no single tradition, but to the shared hope of all who called the prairie home.